So our next speakers are Alastair Dant and Albert Sun, both from the New York Times. Alastair is a web developer and a journalist. Alastair is a web developer who focuses on interactive storytelling and data visualization. And Albert is both a programmer and a journalist who covers the health and science beat for the Times. Together, they're doing really amazing things at the intersection of journalism, data visualization, and the web. Please welcome Alastair and Albert.
Actually, as a web developer, he was editing JavaScript for some of the interactive pieces that he's going to show you just as he was loading his computer. So we're going to really test the limits of technology.
Yeah, we'll test the ability of technology to go wrong on thing. But anyway, yes, good to see you all. And what we're going to talk about now, in a very loose sense, is storytelling with sensors. It's actually a kind of game of two halves. We'll talk about storytelling a little bit, then we'll talk about sensors. We'll try and show how those two things are starting to intersect. And once I've done some general context, Albert's going to talk about a project that we worked on together. So to start with, I wanted to really talk to you about interactive journalism, digital journalism, data journalism, whatever you want to call it. And I wanted to just try and put a little bit of perspective on what the last few years has brought about. People have been using what's known as computer-assisted reporting techniques for quite a long time now. People started using different forms of database analysis way back in the 60s, mainly for investigative purposes. So it was a way of finding stories in large data sets. And what the web's really done for us is it's opened up the possibility that being able to work with data can almost be something we see of as another source. Alongside all the interviews that you might have to conduct and all of the shoe leather you'll have to put into classic reporting, you're now in a position where you can use a variety of data-driven tools to collect together data from various different sources. You can record your own, and then we have a variety of different ways that we can try and tell stories with that data. And that's what I'm going to now try and show a few examples of. So the print tradition really allowed us quite a long time to, I guess, evolve to the state we're in now with respect to explanatory graphics. So I wanted to share this example. This is something that our colleague Jonathan Coram created, and you won't be able to see it. It's very, very small in this respect. I'm going to just click through to the web page, and sadly you'll be kind of in the same position again. Now, what I wanted to say about it, no, but this is actually for good reason. The thing I wanted to say about this is the marvel of this kind of explanatory graphic is its ability to organize. In this case, it's the microbiome. So some of you may have seen this already. And what it manages to do in this very sort of concise visual summary is bring together an awful lot of information. And it's the sort of thing which really works best when you're looking at it in the double-page spread of the printed newspaper. It's got what Edward Tufte calls a very high data ink ratio. So you need a sort of like a fairly high resolution, and in some ways this might even go beyond, you know, it's such a good graphic, it would be the sort of thing that would be perfect to include in a textbook or even a coffee table book or something like that. Now the problem we've got now is that the majority of time when people are looking at our work, they're maybe not in the position to interact with it in that way. They're not necessarily in the position where they can sit and absorb the information at such high resolution. So we're having to start thinking about how we can use digital technology to basically structure our narratives a bit differently. So this piece here is something that I worked on recently. And it's actually a story about motorcycle deaths and the relationship between fatalities in traffic accidents for motorcycle riders, depending on whether or not they're wearing a helmet. And what we wanted to do with this is, can you actually see anything? It looks a bit washed out, but yeah.
Have you reduced the
yeah. I think it's also running at a very high resolution, which probably isn't helping. I might have to change that in a minute. But what we do here is as people scroll, we actually sort of use that as an opportunity to transition between different chapters almost. And each one of those is accompanied by a different state of the chart. So these transitions attempt to step people through the various different parts of the story. There's effectively different facets of the data that we, in this case, took from the US government's fatality accident reporting system or something. It's an incredibly well organized public data source. And what we were able to do is we were able to query that in a number of different ways to figure out the data that we needed to put these charts together. But at no point did we try and bamboozle people with all of that data. We wanted to distill it into some very specific views here. Now, the other thing which I should point out is that when we put this piece together, we were realizing as we were doing it that this wasn't really going to work for people with a phone. And in fact, more and more people every year are coming to the Times via mobile devices. And in fact, we probably still don't spend as much time as we ought when we create these pieces conceiving of the way that they should work on a phone. So in this case, we had a bit of time to spare. And we were able to use the same animation engine, but to basically change it so that it was triggered on swipe. So we got the charts to sort of reformat to fit the phone screen, and then the same chapters can be played through with a swipe gesture. And you end up with something which is a little bit easier to digest. It's a sort of an easier sequence to follow if you're there, somewhere in transit and you're, sort of looking at the phone on the go. You can still get a measure of the story. So when you take this idea of sequencing and you start to really go to town, you come into contact with this whole sort of genre, which has really, I guess, come into bloom in the last couple of years. There was a piece called Snowfall, which you may or may not have heard of, that was very popular. But basically, it's this almost like a renaissance of multimedia. There was a sort of period in the 90s when everyone was very excited about CD-ROMs and all the ways that you could combine media to tell stories. But I think the great thing now is that people have come to realize that you can bring all of those media elements together into a web page. And the broadband that we have, the computer power that we have, means that a sort of humble web page can now be a hub for a lot of different sort of facets of a story. And so this particular series that I want to show you was something which was originally commissioned as a long-form piece. So it was what we call it the paper an enterprise piece. And it's the sort of piece where, because the author is working on it for a long time up front, we're able to maybe start to scheme a bit about how we want to present it. So in this case, this had been one of the chosen pieces that gets to get a special treatment. And what this meant was that, this is interesting, because just for a split second there, you saw it in its naked text-only format. And then it kind of did all the fancy reformatting. And what you see is that the text has basically been augmented with an awful lot of additional stuff. So we have here a nice sort of lead graphic. The story by Libby Rosenthal is about medical procedures in the US and the stark differences in cost that exist across the US. And as we scroll down, we see that there is an awful lot of text, and you have to be fairly committed, admittedly, to kind of get into these pieces, but you get some very nice photography. You also get some video, and you get here a dedicated graphic that helps you understand the difference in prices as you go across the country. So all of these different elements are being brought together into a single narrative flow. But the thing about this series, which is actually I guess the most significant, and the thing that I wanted to share with you, is that we took the opportunity to use it as a platform for starting a conversation with our readers. So above and beyond the normal process of adding comments to an article, which we can do all the time, we wanted in this case to actually use those comments to start a conversation and to actually be able to sort of distinguish between different kinds of commenters and different kinds of opinion. So with a system that has, I think, subsequently become known as structured comments, what you can see here is that there are different filters that we can apply, and we can actually start looking through what were actually a record-breaking number of reader responses. There were over 2,000 responses to the story in a very short space of time. And what's interesting is that this piece, although it sort of started off as an individual piece, ended up becoming a whole 6-part series, because in the context of these comments, stories came forward. Readers became sources for further, further insights and for further investigations that we could do. So this idea of not just a multimedia conglomeration of images and videos and graphics, but actually something which is the seed for a two-way story. You know, in some ways that's maybe a better definition of interactive journalism, if it actually allows our audience to interact with the story and to help us shape the direction that story is going to take. So I think possibly for the sake of fun more than anything, I want to skip on to number 4. Because by this point we'd actually followed the series through a variety of different topics, and we'd ended up looking at the difference in price between specific drugs. And what we have here is a very nice graphic, which in this case looks at asthma inhalers. But if we kind of switch over here, we get what $250 of cold crystal looks like in the US versus Saudi Arabia, which is this fairly stark difference. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. So going back to our different categories, what I've talked about so far, with perhaps the exception of the reader interaction, has been mostly a one-directional street. What we're doing is we're basically using these new journalistic elements in the context of a fairly classic form of reporting. We're assembling all the sources together, and then we're editing it down, and we're trying to tell a story which really has a sort of beginning, a middle, and an end. If we look at tools and news apps, what we start to realize is that there are ways that we can take these data sources and we can actually make them a bit more exploratory. We can make them something that the reader can use as a tool, or really just something which they can find a personal story within. So the first example I've got of this is something that ProPublica did with ER wait times. In managing to, I'm just going to try and zoom this up a bit. Does that work? Oh, that's better. So in managing to assemble all of these wait times, they were able to start calculating averages that let you compare basically state by state the kind of differences that exist in our hospital system. But the nice thing is that because this is an interactive table, we can actually start reordering it. So we can say, for example, the time until sent home, we want to sort by that, and then everything whizzes into this new order, and we can flip it around. Now that's all well and good, but that's still basically an interactive form of an explanatory graphic. The point where this gets really interesting for me is the point where last year my girlfriend and I were cycling in the park next to where we live, and just out of nowhere she had a rather awful crash, and we needed to actually get an ambulance. And I, at that point, was completely naive. And if I'd had access to this, I think it would have been rather useful, because by typing in your postcode, and there is actually a sort of mobile-friendly version as well, we can immediately find information about all of the hospitals near us. And we can see, for example, the contrast, the trade-off between the time it would take to get to a particular hospital and the amount of time that we might be waiting when we get there. So this is also, I think, sensitive to the time of day as well. So this is actually like a genuinely useful tool. And it's something that started with the public release of data by a government, but at that point the government hasn't assigned any context to that information. They've just made a commitment to making that data public. And it's the news organisation that has taken the time to make the appropriate analysis to be able to then create something like this. So very differently, almost flippantly, I want to show you something which is the most popular Times page ever, right? So to put this in perspective, this is more popular than our results pages on election night. This is more popular than, I don't know, the front page on the Super Bowl or something like that. This is a example, actually, that we're looking at now of the result of this Dialect quiz. Now, you may have come across this because millions and millions of Americans took this quiz. And this is actually Albert's result. And it's fairly accurately located Albert as being someone who grew up in the Grand Rapids, Detroit, Michigan area. And the way it does that is basically it asks you a series of questions about what words you would use in a particular context. So the interesting thing about this is it was a guy that came in as an intern who'd been, as a long-standing research project, sending out questionnaires. He collected all the data that makes this statistical model that powers this possible. So he'd basically got 350,000 responses from around the country that was enough for him to then create a probabilistic model of what the likelihood would be for people in a particular sort of geographic quadrant to choose a particular term over another. And so by asking a series of 20 questions about what terms you might use, as long as you're not English like me, and that messes it, forget it. You're going to just get a completely blue map. But the thing here is that it's able to then give someone something which is very personal as a result. So it uses all of that kind of data and statistical stuff in a very, very, I don't know, it's behind the scenes. It's a means to an end. And what really matters, I think, to the reader is the fact that when they share this on Facebook, they have their map. And if the map's accurate, then they can revel in that fact. And if the map's inaccurate, then they can also sort of take some pleasure in that as well. So for whatever reason, this is, an interesting insight into the sort of thing that we might see a lot more of, I think, in the world of online journalism. So I'm now going to switch over to the subject of sensors. And I'm going to take, I suppose, a lead from some of the stuff that Deborah was talking about. We do record, without really thinking about it, more and more data that, right now than we've ever done in the past. And we're in this position, potentially, to start using that as a source in the same way that we're using these other data sets as sources. There are some examples out there of sensor journalism, which some people tried to coin as a phrase last year. There are not many of them, but I'll give a quick whip through. One of the spaces where this kind of makes most sense is a civic context. So there was a project which was actually started here in Boston at the MIT Civic Media Lab. And they ended up teaming up with the Associated Press. And the idea, which may or may not be possible to see because it's very small, the idea was that in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics, the Associated Press was sending across various journalists to cover the Olympics. And the Civic Media Lab got them to agree that every photographer that they were sending over would take a carbon sensor in their equipment bag, because it sort of blended in. Everything was high-tech inside, and the fact there was this $2,000 carbon sensor in there didn't set off any alarm bells. So they were then able to drive around Beijing. You can just about see a photo there with the carbon sensors poked out the windows making recordings. And the consequence of this is they were actually able to build up this map of the Olympic Center to get a sense, or the marathon route in fact, to get a sense of how much pollution the athletes were going to be exposed to. And they also were able to make a comparison, and again it's quite small, between the level of kind of bad things, the number of particulates in Beijing versus, I think, Manhattan over here. Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting is that the equipment they used to make that story nearly 6 years ago now cost $2,000. It was still, I think, really quite exclusive. In the time that's passed subsequently, just in the same way that the genomic sequencing is becoming so much more affordable, all of these sensor technologies are becoming a lot more affordable as well. And this project here, the air quality egg, is a kind of perfect example of that, because now for about $200 and a Kickstarter campaign, you're able to get this device, a kit, which you can build yourself, and there's now a network of people across the whole of the US that are simultaneously submitting data about the quality of the air near them. So this is a kind of community project. It doesn't really have a higher purpose right now, but you can imagine how this kind of stuff could feed into civic action potentially in the future. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to Albert now, and he's going to talk about a project we worked on together.
So I'm going to... Hello? So I'm going to talk about a specific project we worked on, which is about a topic which might be familiar to all of you, self-tracking. So last year, I started working on this story that involved me wearing 11 different activity trackers, about 4 at a time, all the time for 6 months. And I imagine a lot of you in the audience are wearing them in different ways. And so I learned a bunch about myself, my lowest days, I was walking 2,000 or 3,000 steps at best, and those were days when I was sitting on the couch all day watching Netflix. My best day, I think I made it to 25,000. But as part of this project, which was written, but there was another portion, I did a bunch of jumping jacks on camera. And so why did I do jumping jacks? And the reason is because we also worked on this piece, which was an interactive where we recorded data with the same sensor that's used in activity trackers. And we tried to tell a story about it to help people understand it a little bit better. So what does that data look like? Well, it looks like this. And that makes me think a little bit of this, which, if it'll load, you all are in an audience of incredibly quantitative-minded people. When Alastair and I go and speak at journalism conferences, we're considered the numbers people, but here we're like sort of way out of our depth in anything like that. But I don't think any of you even see numbers or work with data like this. This is just not a realistic depiction of how that's done. It's not a realistic depiction of how people think about it. So how do people actually think about and work with data? So we do things like this, right? We summarize, analyze, group it. We tell little stories about it to ourselves, like when this goes up, that goes up. Most things are happening over here on the left side, or things like that. And so for accelerometer data, it might look a little bit like this. So like this is walking in the raw track. And then if you're going to do some analysis on it, you might get something like this if you do a Fourier transform, and then you can like count the steps or something. And then if you build this into a product and you put a lot of design effort into it and you really polish it up, you might get something that looks like this. And so these are, Fitbit, the third one is Basis, the last one is the Fuel Band. And these are the presentations of data that they show to ordinary people who buy the product and are wearing these sensors around. Now, the problem is that some people, most of you, can understand this and you know what to do with it. But most people really don't understand this data still. Even in this cleaned up, much better than a table of numbers form, most people still don't really know what to do with this. And so in the course of reporting this story, I talked to some researchers here at the Center for Connected Health, and they've been running clinical trials using activity trackers. And basically, they identified 3 different groups of people. And so 10% are like quantified selfers. And that's like everyone here, everyone at Get Labs. And you love tracking yourself. You love data. You know exactly what to do with it. It motivates you. You understand it. 20 to 30% more people, they say, you need a little nudge beyond that. You might need like a reminder text message or something. But then there's everyone else, and they don't know what to do with it. And so it's like, you can join like a workplace challenge or something, or you go to like a support group meeting or something to help yourself try and change your behavior and be more active. So at the Times, we think a lot about telling stories with data. And so our colleague, Jonathan Coram, who Alastair mentioned before, he's the science graphics editor, and he's given a bunch of brilliant talks about storytelling. And so one of his points that he makes is that visualization is not explanation. And so I'm going to pick on my own work here, so it's okay that I insult it. This is something I did before. And so that, I think, is an example of a graphic that visualizes something but doesn't really explain it. So the regions are colored by what percentage of users on the New York subway system use a 30-day Metro card. And when I did this, I was really proud because I got margin of error bars into a newspaper, which isn't something that happens very often. But still, this doesn't really tell a story in a way that someone can comprehend well. So the problem here is that I made this, and I was my own audience. I had understood the data so well by the time I made this visualization that it didn't really matter what form it was in. And so there's another way that you could tell the story, and it might look something like this, where this is the same data that was collected in those previous app screens, but it's just shown in a slightly different way. And now the story is you sat on your butt for 11 hours watching Netflix, which is something a little bit more memorable. It's the same underlying data, but now it's kind of in a story. But the problem with this story is that every story kind of leaves things out. This summarizes a little too much, and I think this might oversimplify it. And so a problem with activity trackers is that people kind of think they're magic. And so that's what we tried to sort of dispel with this project we worked on with sensor data was we tried to show a little bit about, what does this thing do? What does the see in the data when you're looking at it? And so we got our colleague Scott to ham around a little bit with it. And so you can see here that he's exercising, but you're not seeing all that much in the data. But over here, over here he's eating chips, but what's going on over here? It looks really active, right? Like he must be doing something intense here. Well, okay. And so then we got Scott to do some jumping jacks too, and he was in a Sony commercial at one point, so he's got some physical talent. And so by watching the video and seeing the story about what Scott's doing, you can understand it better. And that's sort of what you try and do when you tell a story, is that you want to take all this stuff that's happening to you and transform it. You put it into your memory and be able to understand it and relate it to people and tell someone about it and be able to think back on it. And so that day when I was wearing all the activity trackers, when I walked 25,000 steps, that was a day when I went to this place in the Hudson Valley called the Storm King Art Center, which is this amazing outdoor sculpture garden. And so part of the reason I remember it is not the 25,000 steps. I don't remember all the walking. I don't remember the individual data points. I remember the sky. I remember the changing leaves. I remember seeing this sculpture all lit up and lying underneath it. And that's the story that you need to get to with the data.